it's a fun thing. Yeah.
We got the ability to. Okay, people are just rolling in right now. Welcome everyone as you're rolling in. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for everyone to join. We have over 100 people coming on today, so we're really excited about it. Happy Sunday. So we're just going to wait just 2 minutes. You can see all of our faces here. And for those who don't know, my name is Nate Johnson, and you see my face at the conventions, and you see my face during the video Q&As, our monthly Q&As, and then every once in a while I'm in a photo, but usually I'm behind the camera. But I'm just so happy that everyone's here, and we are going to have a wonderful talk today about misophonia. I am not going to be hosting this one. Our wonderful board member, John Smoot, our newest board member, John Smoot, will be doing the heavy lifting today. But I'm going to start just with ground rules as we are getting started. If this is your first time, welcome. You guys don't have to worry about yourselves being on camera or other participants being on camera, but our panelists will do their best to try and not eat on camera or drink on camera. So you guys are in a very safe space. We don't try to ask questions that have specific triggers, just because we don't want to create more triggers for the people that are here. So if you have specific questions about triggers, try to make them as generalized as possible. So loud noises, things like that. For the Q&A, we have a list of questions that we have already submitted from you, but you are able to also use the Zoom capabilities to ask and do the Q&A as well. If you go down to the very bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button, and you should be able to click on that and open up and ask questions and all of those kinds of fun things. So there also is the chat option as well, and we're going to be monitoring that for you guys as we continue on. So for further ado, I'm going to introduce John Smoot, and he is going to take it from here and introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Nate. Nate the Great. This is a side note, Nate, real quick. You might want to take a look at your settings. I think I might have accidentally changed something in the group, and we don't want to get invaded. So I apologize if I did. Just take a quick look. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Misophonia Association online clinic for June the 4th, 2023. My name is John Smoot, and I'm a board member of the Misophonia Association. I'll be your host. Thanks for joining us. I am also in the healthy habit of making shameless plugs just about any time I do something like this. So first, shameless plug time, a little business. I admin 2 misophonia support groups on Facebook, and I hope you'll join as many support groups as you can, if they're a good fit for you, or even join them all if that works, because it's not a competition. And we in the misophonia community need to stand together as much as possible, as many ways as possible, to support peace. Here's the first stutter of the presentation. You'll probably see me do that a few times. To support misophonia awareness, misophonia research for treatments and potential cures. We need to support each other as a community. So that said, I hope you'll consider my groups. Links to both groups are posted in the chat screen, and they are, for those of you who qualify and live in the Western and Pacific regions of the USA, a Western and Pacific Misophonia Support Group. And for you same Western and Pacific people, as well as any other qualifying person who lives on planet Earth, Misophonia, I renamed it. Misophonia Without Borders might be your group. Maybe both of these groups will be your groups. And to clarify one thing I did not write down to sit over here, I see qualifying person, and that might confuse somebody. I'm a little uncomfortable that I wrote that. By qualifying person, I mean someone who has misophonia, someone who supports someone with misophonia. It's a little more open than some groups. You know, we all have our place, and even some industry experts, so to speak, may be members of the group. And there's a few other exceptions that I make at my discretion. I've covered it in the rules. And so back to the main thing here. Last but certainly not least, before we get to the main event, I got to mention this year's Misophonia convention. Yay! The Misophonia Association has been hosting these conventions for a decade, all face-to-face, until COVID changed things in 2020, assuming everybody knows. Staff right, what a bummer. So COVID put a stop to so many good things, but the convention wasn't one of them because we kept them going as online conventions until now. This will be our first hybrid convention. For those of you who don't know what we mean by hybrid convention, it means that you have the option to attend online from the comfort of your PC, iPhone, Android, whatever, or in person at the Hilton Embassy Suites in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The convention will start with a meet and greet on Thursday evening, November 2nd, and will continue through November 3rd and 4th with 2 days of informative presentations about research, treatments, coping strategies, and more, not to mention the awesome benefit of getting to know others in the Misophonia community. Again, the convention dates are Thursday, November 1st through Saturday, November 3rd, online or in person at the Hilton Embassy Suites in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Registration is now open. And for adults, attendees only, there is an early bird discount of $25 if you register before July 1st. To be clear, the discount doesn't apply to youth attendees because the fee for their attendance is already way cheaper than the adult fees. Link for registration and to get more information is also in the chat screen. I'll be reposting that stuff throughout probably if I can make the time. That was a lot. Let me take a breath. Okay, now on to what you all came here for. Let me introduce you to our speakers, our panelists. Dr. Tana Carson is an occupational therapist from Gainesville, Florida, who has served as assistant professor at both the University of Florida and Florida International University. Dr. Carson is also co-founder of Impact Autism at the University of Florida and the vice president of All Kids, Inc. Jenna Northen is an occupational therapist from Richmond, Virginia, my home state. Her specialties include auditory therapy, autism, neurofeedback, sensory and integration therapy, among others, and she's also managing owner of Spot On Therapy Group in Richmond, Virginia. Dr. Jaylene Jaffe is a psychiatrist. I'm giving the wrong credit there. I'm gonna get us in trouble. Dr. Jaylene Jaffe is a psychotherapist and author from Sherman Oaks, California, where she offers therapy for relationship issues, depression, anxiety, stress management, and other conditions through her practice, Lemonade Counseling. Also a board member of the Misophonia Association, Dr. Jaffe offers counseling for tinnitus and misophonia through her website, sensitivetosound.com. I'm going to step back now as our guests share with us their work with misophonia. And after their presentations, we'll have a question and answer session for you. Let's talk with Dr. Tana Carson. Hi, Dr. Carson. Thanks for joining us. Please tell us about your work with misophonia.
Hi there. I think it started very young in age for me, growing up with a cousin who has autism and what we now know as misophonia, and then getting into practice in occupational therapy at Shands Hospital in Gainesville and realizing that in occupational therapy, we were getting so many referrals for kids who had autism, but also auditory sensitivities, and really not very strong tools or treatment strategies. And so I started turning my research focus in that direction and looking at how we can assess and treat this challenge for children and families with autism. That's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button there for a second. I moved everything around on my screen. Hello, Jenna Northen. Thank you for being here. Please tell us about your work with misophonia.
Thanks for having me. I have been a practicing occupational therapist since '93, and I see both children and adults. And I think my first introduction to misophonia was around 2012, 2013, when I had a few clients that presented differently than what I would consider typical auditory hypersensitivities, and they were their symptoms were different. They were not responding quite the same way to some of my usual techniques, and somehow this has just taken me down a whole different path of trying to find help for this particular population. And now I've got actually a third of my caseload. I see people for a variety of reasons, and a third of my caseload have misophonia. And I think that the awareness is increasing and people are now seeking services, which is how they're finding me. But I'm very interested to learn from the others on the panel and looking forward to another convention in October. That's it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And Dr. Jaffe, hello. Such a wealth of info and experience. What would you like to share with us today?
I'm Dr. Jolene Jaffe. That's how it's pronounced, Jolene. I've been a therapist for ever, 40 something years. The last decade has been almost entirely with people with misophonia. I have had a lot of opportunities to work with hundreds and hundreds of people with misophonia and their families. As a family therapist, I am able to look at the things that are going on in a broader perspective, not just as this particular disorder, which is certainly disruptive, but also it affects everybody in the family, as y'all would know. So I have that broader perspective. I'm one of the founding members of the Misophonia Association, and I have done presentations at every one of the conferences, the conventions that we've had to date. And I get much of my new information from conversations that I have with people online and in person, but since COVID, all online, all over the country and even beyond the country's borders. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you for that. And we're glad to have you all here. And we have a list of questions that were previously submitted, and there are also questions showing up in the Q&A window as well. Let's start with one from the list. I've heard this one a few times. Is misophonia linked to a sensory processing disorder? Anybody want to take that one?
Hannah, do you want to start with that one? Tana, sorry.
No problem. I think that it, from what I've read, and Jenna, you might have a lot to weigh in on with this. I think that it certainly can be viewed through a sensory processing lens as overreactivity or over responsivity to the auditory, to stimuli in the auditory domain. But as far as a specific link solely to sensory processing disorder, I'm not sure about that.
And I'm going to agree with that. The research that we have so far is indicating that they are different. In my professional view, the presentation, even though there's a lot of overlap and similarity, I definitely see a difference. There's brain scans showing the activated areas of the brain. So if people are interested in finding some of that information, some of the links on the Misophonia Association website will probably lead you to that. There are a lot of strategies that we use that work for both. But if misophonia ends up down the line being added to the umbrella of sensory processing disorder, it's going to have its own subcategory, I think. That's my opinion.
Let me add to that misophonia is not yet listed in any of the code books. The DSM, which is the code book that's used by the mental health community, and the ICD, which is the code book used by the medical community. Misophonia does not exist. It's why you go to a doctor and they open the book and they say, sorry, there's no such thing. Yeah, many of you families have had that experience. Sensory processing disorder is also not yet in any of the code books. We don't know that either one of these is going to end up in the code books eventually. Probably they will. But before that happens, there needs to be a lot more research. And I think one of the problems is in deciding where to put them. Like, are they distinct standalone disorders, or are they part of something else? My personal opinion, after having worked with hundreds of people is that misophonia ought to be a standalone disorder because it isn't like anything else, even though it overlaps or has common characteristics to other things. But we'll have to wait and see where that goes.
Okay, and it's actually what you just said helped me to pick the next question. Is misophonia a neurological disorder or a psychological disorder?
I'll hop in on that and then hear what the OTs have to say. Initially, it was believed to be an auditory disorder because, you know, people hear things and that's what they are having reactions to. Over the course of time since it's been identified, it was named initially by Dr. Johnson, whose face is on the screen, although she's not officially participating, but she's definitely here. She's typing answers in the background and so forth. She named it Selective Sound Sensitivity Syndrome, 4S, and then it got renamed by somebody else as misophonia, which is not a very accurate name, but it's stuck because it's cute, I guess. It's simpler to say or something like that. But it initially was thought to be auditory, and then people started thinking, oh, it's psychological. You folks are just having a hard time with your family and your kids are being, you know, behavior problems and all of that sort of thing. More recently, the research looks like from brain scans that they've done, it is neurological. So my perspective is it's a neurological disorder and it has all sorts of psychological overlay and problems because it creates so many problems for the emotional system and for family members. So I think it's both of those. That's my perspective.
I agree 100%.
Same.
Okay. I'm gonna take a question from the Q&A window here, and just to clarify something, Dr. Johnson appears to be answering most or all of the questions there. I'm still gonna pick some questions from here and ask them when I feel it's appropriate, because even though Dr. Johnson's given an answer, we still want to hear from panelists who might even elaborate a little more on the situation verbally or the answer verbally. So there was one here just a second ago and it scrolled down while I was talking there. How do I communicate to family that misophonia is a thing and not just in my head?
I'll throw something out there. If you're already working with a professional, that professional might be able to help you formulate how to explain misophonia, providing resources that will help back up what this disorder is. It also depends on who you're trying to convince. You know, is it a parent or a grandparent or a sibling? You have to tailor how you present this based on who your audience is. There are times if you're trying to do this without the help of a professional, there are certainly resources available that might be able to help you, but I do think it might be easier if you've got a professional that's backing up or that's offering education as well. It's not just you trying to convince your family members or your friends that this thing is real.
I'll hop in on this too. I think one of the biggest reliefs for people is when they go online and they start, typing in things. I had a client who typed in years ago, my dad just did, and fill in the blank what the problem was that he just did, and I want to kill him, and she typed that into a search. And what came up was, oh, guess what? There's a name for that. There's something about having a name for it that is the first sense of relief, like, oh, I'm not crazy. This is a real actual thing. There are some websites online that have explanations. You can go to, for example, soquiet.org. Chris has some very good explanations. You can get some cards from him, free cards, it's like a business card thing that explains what it is, so you can hand it to somebody. There is a film that came out a few years ago called Quiet Please, that was produced by a person who has misophonia, Jeff Gould. It's a good way to explain to people that don't think it's a real thing that yes, it is. It's I think it's a 2-hour video or something like that, but there's a 2.5-minute trailer that at least is an introduction. So there are resources out there to help you explain to family members or teachers or whomever that yes, this is a real thing and there's research being done. And it's difficult because it's invisible to other people. They don't, if you had if you were in a wheelchair, everybody would know to hold the door open for you. But this thing is invisible, so they don't know what they should or should not do or what would be helpful because they don't know what's happening. It's all happening internally. So it's a little harder to address because of that.
All right, take another question from the Q&A window here, and I want to clarify one more thing, and I'm sorry, folks, I'm kind of learning some of this as I go. Most of the people asking questions are keeping it anonymous, which is fine. You have that option, exercise it if you like. Some of you are putting your names on, so if I see that your name is on the question, I'm gonna say your name and give you credit for asking the question, which, yeah, that's personal choice, but just in case you don't mean to put your name on it, I'm sure there must be a checkbox or something if you want to be anonymous. Make sure you take care of that, or I'll make you famous. So let's make Alyssa Snyder famous. She has a good question. Can you talk about misophonia in children? Does it get worse with age? I know my feelings on this. Can't wait to hear yours. Tana Carson, maybe start this one. Dr.
So,
Carson?
I also have questions about this. So I don't necessarily have an answer on this. And I think from my perspective, it probably depends on several factors. One, have they had some kind of treatment or support? And at what age did they seek that treatment or support? I think with anything like this, it takes time to develop your strategies and hone in on what works for you. And there's a certain bit of maturity that comes with that too. And as we age and our hormones change, things change in our reactivity. So I think that anytime we're talking about development, there are so many different factors to consider along the way. Some things get better just because the kids went through a mental growth spurt and they've had some changes in the way they look at things and approach things. And sometimes growth spurts lead to challenges and we need more support at that time. So I don't really have a yes or no on that. And I'm very curious to see what people with much more experience than I have clinically have seen in patients long term.
I'd like to hear from all of you on this one. We could. Maybe.
I'm scrolling through, I'm looking at some of the questions in here, so I didn't hear everything that you said. But as far as going forward over time, I agree with you that maturity helps. I mean, when I get kids referred, of course, it shows up so young, and just brain developmentally, if you think about the way schools are organized, there's preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school. They're divided at approximately the time when brain development shifts according to Piagetian analysis or what theory. So up until about age 12 or so, children are at what's called a concrete developmental level. It's very much more challenging to get them to look at things. Like the biggest issue, I think, at the beginning is thinking that the problem is that person over there doing that thing that they are doing. And as long as you think that's what the problem is, which is a natural thing for a young child to believe, it's a very difficult uphill road to help those kids figure out what to do about it because they don't think they can or should do anything about it because they don't think it's their problem. They think it's what everybody else is doing. Once kids reach about the age of 12, there's a shift in from what's called concrete to abstract thinking, according to Piaget, and they can begin to operate in more constructive ways of thinking and approaching this. And then they get the power given to themselves to do something about it because they have to recognize that the problem is actually not what everybody else is doing. It's what their neurological system is doing with the thing that everybody else is doing. And then they're better able to learn, how to manage it. As far as over time, I've had lots of kids that I've worked with go through high school, go through college, be in dorms, get into relationships, have jobs, have families. All of that can happen. So it isn't a matter of, oh, this is a death sentence. You're stuck with this and you'll never be able to do X, Y, or Z. That's very likely not the case once people learn some ways to manage it. If at least that much ways to manage it, they get better able to function in the world.
Got another question on the list. It's kind of redundant at this one, but the second part of it is one interesting. It says, does misophonia progressively worsen? I think basically covered that, but second part says, has it ever lessened or gone away?
If I am going by the reports of some of my clients, yes, it can lessen. I have not had any of my clients where it has completely gone away, but I've had quite a few who feel like they are able to manage it using strategies and going through some of the therapy approaches that I use. I would say definitely yes.
I would say definitely yes to it being better managed over time. Does it ever go away? The research, this thing was only named approximately 20 years ago. So the research is very in its infancy, and there is more research going on every year. A lot of it is now based on the neurological aspect, since there is evidence, concrete evidence that there's something going on neurologically. So there is more and more research now happening that I think eventually might lead to a place where it is more possible to make it go away in some ways. We'll have to see, but some people are using some of the more brain-based somatic kinds of approaches, somatic therapies, EMDR, brain spotting, a variety of different approaches. I think one of the questions that was on here had to do with sequent repatterning, which is the program that is happening in the UK and a few other places, that they're trying to address the neurological system itself. And I think over time we'll see more results coming from that.
Okay, it's funny. I'm reading a lot of these questions, and I've been asking some of these same questions since the very beginning. This one ties into something that I call miso guilt. It's from the list, and it says, why is it that I can tolerate noises that I make? However, when another person creates the same noise, I cannot tolerate it. Frustrating.
I'm not sure that I am the best person to answer that. In my experience, it all comes down to control, that you can control part of it. Part of it has to do with the fact that you can control your own noises, and also the noises that you make sound very different because you're taking them, and the noises that you make yourself, you're hearing them also through vibration. So I don't know if that has anything to do with how you perceive it and how you're able to tolerate it. But there are also people with misophonia who are triggered by themselves as well. So again, I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that. And why one person might be a trigger and the other people aren't. So, Jolene?
Yeah, well, that one, why is one person a worse trigger than other people? There's no definitive answer to that. I have a lot of thoughts about that, partly because that person is someone that likely someone you live with, your parent or your sibling or something like that. And so therefore you spend more time with that person, and over time, something that you didn't notice may become, it's like a little grain of sand in your shoe. And over time it begins to rub and it begins to get to be a blister and it gets to be more and more annoying. So people are more likely to be reactive to someone at home because they interact with them a lot. I think the psychological side of that is there's also more reaction because you know that thing bothers me and you still keep doing it. You're just an awful person. Whereas they don't think that of someone that they encounter in another place who doesn't know. So there's that additional level. As far as, go ahead.
I want to come on here at some point, but I can't get my image to show, but I would like a chance to answer this question as well.
Go for it.
I wonder if somebody can make my face come on the screen though, Nate.
Nate
Who
can
disabled my face, Nate, who disabled my face. Now I'm
come back,
frozen.
Nate.
Nate's probably out taking a little sun in the Mexican summer down there. I'll tell you, he may turn me on, but is it okay if I just talk while I'm sitting there frozen? It might even be better. There is a scientific explanation for that question. And I wrote a couple of articles off and on about this, and I call it sound prints. You have fingerprints, and fingerprints are unique, aren't they? They can be used to identify you from 8 billion people on the planet. Your fingerprints are different. So I came up with this idea long ago about the word sound prints. And so you remember that everything in your body, all of your external senses, all they do is they turn into electrical patterns in your brain. Your brain doesn't get chocolate up there. Your brain doesn't get the smell of a rose. It gets an electrical specific pattern that people have learned to identify over time. And we're really, really good at it. If you do that little smell test or even touching, we can identify thousands and thousands of things. We know, but it's all electrical patterns in your neurological system. It isn't anything other than that. It's like those weird QR codes that you have to use to go to restaurants now that I can't quite figure out where the menu is, okay? Those blotty things that you show up everywhere, right? So your brain, right from childhood, early, pre-birth even, you begin to identify certain sounds as having meaning. Everything you can imagine. Even we know scientifically that all babies are born sort of open books. They could learn any language on earth, but within the first 6 months, Jolene loves this theory, by the way, because your brain prunes away. Your brain prunes away. It self-prunes like a tree. It prunes away all the areas that relate to certain phonemes or noises that you don't make in your language. And you can't get that back very easily, actually. So you're really good at this. You're born for this, so that you know that's chocolate ice cream and that's salsa. And you know, and you establish. So the thing that happens with misophonia, because of this onset time, somewhere usually 7 or 8, maybe up to 13 years old is most common. It's almost always initially sounds. It can spread to other senses, that for sure. 40% of people have visual, so forth. Your brain is really good at discerning the way one particular person does or says or has some action associated with a particular electrical pattern. So you're sitting at the table, maybe. How many times have we heard of this? Thousands of times. Certain family members are fine. They don't bother you. Certain family members, all they have to do is one small step toward a trigger and you're hyper responsive and very upset and very emotionally low level triggered emotions, low down in the brain. You're not thinking in the top of your brain, I wonder what flavor of taco chips. No, you are so reactive, like a survival level reactive sense that's got to be down in the brain, bottom down there somewhere, that you're just in a tsunami of feeling and emotion and action. It's a really deep, deep sensation. And so I believe that the child imprints. They imprint on those sounds, or adults imprint, and then for whatever reason, those triggers, those sound prints, they don't move along. They don't move out of your house, so to speak. They're permanently living with you, an unwelcome guest. And that's what I have to say about that. I hope I explained it as clearly as I could, but I believe this is deeply physiologic in the brain. That's a neurologic response that we're not even sure where it's located, much less how to make it move out. There you go.
Want to add to that? Okay. So I saw this other question I wanted to ask on the list that's kind of the opposite of that, but I suspect it might wind up being redundant. Just get a similar answer. So you tell me if it triggers any kind of other answer from any of you. My 10-year-old is triggered by others breathing, but also his own breathing, struggling to find a solution. So now we're talking about self-trigger, which some of us do, some of us don't, some of us do occasionally. Take that one, or do you feel that was pretty much covered with the last question? Take that as covered with the last question.
I think the OTs may have a thought about that. I'm not sure.
What's that?
I was thinking that our OTs may have a thought about that one. I don't know.
Certainly love to hear it if they do.
I actually have not had a patient with self-triggering. So I was really curious to see what you all would say about that, if you had experience with that, and like how to approach that, because I'm sure I'll come across it. It sounds reasonable that that could happen.
I actually have not had an experience either where someone is triggered by themselves. So I'm learning with all of you. You know, I can certainly make some suggestions. If the hard part here is we're trying not to list or say specific triggers, so it's a little bit more difficult. I am very willing to speak with that person if they wanted to call me or email. Maybe we can talk through that. Or if they have a professional that they're working with, I don't mind trying to brainstorm. Was the specific trigger mentioned in the Q&A? Maybe I can try to work
Actually,
around
this was
that.
from the list, so I have no idea where it originated.
Okay.
These fire. But it is possible that person is attending. If they submitted a question, I would hope they'd be here and heard you and we'll try to reach out to you.
The one thing I would suggest, if and based on the questions, if it's I would work with that person on trying to change how they hold their mouth so that it might impact the sounds enough. Am I allowed to say what the trigger is without getting into trouble? Would you rather me not?
No, I
Jolene?
think in this case, you can go right ahead and say that.
Okay,
It's okay.
Sorry. All right, so the child is being triggered by their own breathing. And kind of in hindsight, I have had someone with a similar issue. And what we worked on was trying to hold the mouth differently so that the sound was different. And for that person, it was enough. It might be worth a try. Any other suggestions, Tana?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me is if they have a strategy that has worked for other people with the same trigger, it might be worth trying for their own trigger, with, slight modifications, but not knowing more context and more background, it's really tough to provide specific advice because there could be other nuances to take into consideration. But I think, I like what you said too.
It might be taking in air through the nose, kind of working on effective breathing patterns, and teaching them how to exhale softly in different ways with their mouth slightly parted so that it is not as offensive.
Mhm.
Just experiment with that a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
and I
break,
think,
go ahead. Go ahead.
oh no, I think it's important to think about too how the person's reacting to the trigger, and then thinking about the types of regulation strategies. If you're reacting and your heart's racing, or you're reacting and you have a physiological response, your specific self-regulation strategies that you use when you feel that way in response to other triggers might be helpful in the situation with your own trigger as well. But again, not knowing enough about the person and their experience, it's tough to say. But I like what you're saying too, Jenna. I think that that's a really interesting idea.
Something that just came to mind, I don't know how many of you have ever put on headphones yourself, but you sound very different to yourself with headphones on, and you can hear your breathing. It's more pronounced with headphones. So for the person that wrote this question, one thing to think about is, are they already using noise canceling headphones as a strategy that potentially might be adding to the problem? I don't know. I'm just, again, throwing ideas out there.
John, there's a question in the Q&A that I would like to address. And then there's one specifically asking Jenna a question about techniques that you think have had the most success. But let me go to this one about, does cognitive behavioral therapy help with misophonia? So one of the big challenges for all of our family members out there is finding someone who can help. There are many places you go and you talk to the doctor, you talk to the audience, whoever it is you talk to, and they never heard of it and they don't know what to do with it. And sometimes they do things that actually make it worse. I've seen a lot of people who've come to me after they've been to a therapist who misinterpreted misophonia as a phobia of sounds and treated it as if it were a phobia, like you like a therapist might treat you're afraid of dogs or something like that. And, sit in the middle of this circle, and we're going to have all your family members do that thing that you hate, and you're going to just get used to it. I mean, that kind of exposure therapy is devastating. It's very hard. Cognitive behavioral therapy is what's kind of known as a top-down approach. It's based on thinking. It's based on how your thoughts are related to what is happening in your body. And it's a very good approach. It's not, in my opinion, sufficient or adequate enough to deal with misophonia, because much of misophonia has nothing to do with cognitive processing at all. So I think it's helpful to have more than one depth level of approaching it. So adding in, what I've done over the years is adding in a number of different psychological and neurological approaches to make it more multidimensional beyond just cognitive behavioral therapy. But if the closest you can come, if that's who you can find in your neck of the woods, is someone who does CBT. That's probably better than nothing, because it will help you think differently and manage it differently, which is, certainly better than just suffering. So I don't think it's broad enough, but it's definitely useful to a degree.
I actually thought you were gonna address a different question, but I'll throw that one out later. The question that was directly for Jenna Northen that comes from the Q&A, it's an anonymous attendee asking this one. What are the techniques that Miss Northen feels have had the most success?
Well, kind of piggybacking off of what Jolene was saying, I tend to use a two-pronged approach, top down, using cognitive strategies to try to teach people accommodation techniques to manage in the moment. But the overall goal is to make neurological changes. And from my training, what I'm trying to do is decrease the overall stress or arousal level of the their nervous system. And because there is a direct correlation, the higher your stress level, the worse misophonia and traditional sensitivities become. And it's just this vicious cycle. So if we can calm the nervous system down, which takes time, it takes a lot longer than using compensation strategies. So I do both. I use a program called Zones of Regulation. I use it with children and adults. I modify it depending on the age of the person. The whole concept is to increase self-awareness of kind of what zone you're in. Are you in a good place that day or that moment? Or are you going into I'm going to use an example. Are you going into a classroom and you're already stressed because you just came out of a long exam? So you're already tweaked. Well, that means that you're probably going to be more susceptible to triggers in that next class. So I try to get people to think ahead, recognize what zone you're in now, look at what you've got ahead of you, either that day or that coming week. And then we talk about different strategies that will work. And I usually, I kind of have a laundry list of things that I talk about with all of my clients, and they're going to pick. It's almost like a buffet. I want them to practice with all of them, and then they're going to pick which ones work for them and which ones work in school or in the car with their parents or at home at meal times. So not all of them are going to be appropriate for all situations and environments. So, getting them to think ahead, but then some of my other strategies for the long term of calming that nervous system down, I use sound therapies. I use neurofeedback. Neurofeedback's not appropriate for everyone, and it's not covered by insurance in the state of Virginia. So a lot of my families aren't able to take advantage of that option. But I've had a lot of people who have been able to gain benefit with just some of the regulation strategies and the cognitive strategies, that they may not need some of the bigger tools, if that makes sense. So if you're asking for specific, the regulation techniques, and that might be practicing the effective breathing, making sure that you have, if you're in a school system, that you've got a 504 or something that is going to allow you to take breaks or go to a different classroom to take tests, or talking with a family to work out accommodations during mealtime. So, and one of the most important things about this is education, education, education. Knowledge is so critical and so powerful. If the person with misophonia has a better understanding of what's going on with their body, they're more likely to take responsibility for what's going on and become more active in advocating for themselves, whether it's with family or relatives or school staff, employees, co-workers, whatever the case may be. And it just, that education piece gives them a sense of validation. I give them resources so that they can look into other things if the tools that I have are not strong enough. I don't just throw my hands up and go, I'm sorry, we did the best we could. And I'm sending them to other people. I'm giving them the resources for all of these wonderful professionals saying, you now with telehealth, you can get access to these services. You don't have to be live and in person with them. So I hope that helped answer the question to some extent.
Can I just say, I'm so excited to hear you say that and to meet you today, Jenna, because we're both occupational therapists and there aren't many people in occupational therapy that are familiar with the word misophonia yet. It's growing and the awareness is growing, which is fantastic. But it's so exciting to hear you describe the same process that I take, and we're in two different states, but within the same profession, looking at this problem and approaching this problem for people in a similar fashion, and seeing changes and seeing that it's beneficial. So just to kind of, I guess, tell you that I'm very excited to hear you say that, and that to hear it kind of validating for me that I'm approaching these things in a way that makes sense to others as well. So that's exciting. One thing that I could add to that is, thinking about this with autism, there are some extra layers, when you think about the cognitive side of things and what Dr. Jaffe was speaking about earlier, in regards to maturity and development and being able to kind of see where someone else is coming from, and that sound is not intended to inflict harm, that it's just a sound that somebody's making, unaware that they're making you feel any way, shape, any sort of way. With autism, sometimes we have different levels of understanding in that takes time. So one of the things that I add into that cognitive piece you were talking about in a psychoeducation phase is myth busting or fact or fiction, or opinion versus fact. And so we become scientists and we start exploring. And I've even had kids interview, okay, when you just whistled, were you whistling? It's a multiple choice survey we're doing. Were you whistling for fun? Were you whistling to be annoying? Were you whistling to hurt my ears? Or were you whistling because you need my attention? And so we kind of go on these fact-finding missions to find out and to work on some of that theory of mind of figuring out where someone else is coming from. So I think there are just, additional layers of consideration and strategies that OTs and other therapists, psychotherapists, and psychologists are well equipped to do and think through. So if you're a parent out there of a child with autism who also has misophonia and you're going for support, some of those other things to consider in line with the cognitive behavioral therapy approaches that people might be taking. Also, therapressure. You were mentioning some self-regulation strategies, and I come from a background in comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics and Tourette's. And so one of the strategies that we use a lot, one of the ways that we think about using strategies is that you want to incorporate self-regulation strategies that can be used anywhere and kind of go from a least to most approach. So if in order to use my self-regulation strategies, I need a book and some markers and a fidget item and a whole bag of things, I need to make sure I have my fanny pack with all of those things with me at all times when I might need those things to regulate. But are there ways that we can get the same response in your body of self-regulation and kind of calming the nervous system down that are more readily available? And so there are simple things like finger squeezes, right? If we all just take a minute and squeeze our hands, and this doesn't work for everybody, it's a very individualized thing, self-regulation, but just take a minute to squeeze the little muscle bellies on all of your fingers between the joints. It's hard for me not to feel more relaxed doing that. And that's something that I always have with me. I always have my hands and I can inconspicuously just make some squeezes. So TheraPressure, and looking really thoroughly at the other sensory domains, because auditory might be triggering, but other sensory systems might be calming, and you can really capitalize on that for self-regulation. So just some 2 cents to add to what all of the wonderful things that Jenna said and Dr. Jaffe said.
All right,
I want to speak up. I want to say one thing here, just in response. We are so happy to have the occupational therapists here. We have discovered over our research over 25 years, our own work here, that many children will be developing this in their early and elementary years. And so within the school systems, who do they see? The teacher says the child's having trouble in class. So who is around now? We no longer have every school used to have like a psychologist that they called, I don't remember now, life specialist or something. But guess who's still there? The occupational therapists, hugely involved. So we really are desiring your field, your group, to be able to say, well, okay, this could be misophonia. Because how do we help all the thousands of occupational therapists in this country get a grip on this? You might be the first person to see that kid.
Marcia, I'm going to add to that the dilemma with the OTs in the school systems is that they have dwindling OTs with increasing caseload. And so most children are on more what we call consultative, and they may not, number one, may not be familiar with misophonia, but they also may not see the child enough. And I've had someone tell me recently that we're really reliant on the teachers to follow through, even if you've got the most amazing OT, relying on the teachers to follow through with the strategies. If the child doesn't have OT in the school, but you're working with them as an OT, then ask permission to speak with the school directly. I think educating the school staff is a tremendous piece, and I can say that from experience with a current client now. And the little boy said to the teacher in an IEP meeting, or actually he said to her after an 1.5-hour IEP meeting, he said, "You sat in there for an 1.5 hours and you didn't learn anything." And I think it was a humbling moment for her. And she did make some changes after that. And I'm like, holy cow, that's what you call self-advocacy. But going back to what Tana was saying, we also support the family backing off, the parents backing off of doing everything for the child. And it takes a lot of questions, a lot of detail to kind of figure out what's going on at home, and realizing, now I know why he's not using his strategies, because he's over there, mom's over here, and she's got the tool bag with her. So working on, okay, what do we need to do to try to push this along and get the child to take responsibility for the toolkit, for that, the little fanny pack, whatever you want to call it, backpack full of tools, and working as a family to try to support that increased independence.
I want to go back to something Jenna raised and Marcia also addressed, which we're talking about schools. And there is a question on the questions that were sent in. How do you get a professional diagnosis to support getting an IEP? Well, you have to see a professional who can work with your child and knows what misophonia is and can understand what the issues are in order to create an official appeal to the school to put an IEP or a 504 plan in place. So those of us who've worked with a lot of kids over time are well able to do that. So people, if I've seen somebody for a while, I can't do this if I've never met the person or never talked with the person. I can't just say, oh yeah, I'm going to go advocate for you to have a 504 plan. But once I've spent some time with this particular child and we've come to some conclusions about here's what you need in order to have a level playing field. For those of you who are on the call who do not perhaps know what we're talking about here, a 504 is a section of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was originally put into place to help a kid who was in a wheelchair and couldn't get into a classroom because there were stairs. And ever since there was a lawsuit about that many years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act was put into place that says, you know, you folks are paying for public education. Your kid can't get in the room because there are stairs and he's in a wheelchair. Ramps were built. And now there are ramps on everywhere, every school, every public building. By extension, other things that are preventing children from getting an adequate or equal educational opportunity are covered under the 504 plan. So an example would be misophonia. If you can't pay attention and take a test because of all the stuff going on around you, you should be allowed to take that test in a different room. You're not going to do well on the test doesn't mean that you don't know the material. It means you were perhaps distracted by all the things that other people were doing around you at the time. So a 504 plan addresses that. It's reviewed by a committee. Every school has a committee. It's federal law. Every school has a committee and they read the letter that I have created to send, or any of these other folks who are able to do that, that explains here's what the problem is and here's what this child needs for you to accommodate so that they can have, it's not that they get any advantages that other people don't have, it's to level the playing field so that they can have as great as an opportunity to do well in class as anyone else does. And so commonly that would be things like taking a test in a different room, sitting in a different part of the classroom that makes it easier for them, being allowed to get up and leave periodically to calm themselves down, things like that. And sometimes there are other specific things that are added because of the particular child. So the person who wrote in the question, the way to get a professional diagnosis to support getting an IEP is find a professional to work with who knows about misophonia and is able to help you with that. And sometimes, I'm sorry to say, good luck finding that person because, you know, as we're saying, there aren't as many people out there yet who know enough about this to be able to assist, but there are more all the time.
And on that note, let's go to our next question. From an anonymous attendee, is online therapy as successful as in-person for this disorder? I've been having a hard time trying to find someone in the area, but I've seen some online help available.
Well, I don't know about OT because OT is more of an in-person, hands-on kind of approach often. So the OTs will have to reply to that. I can tell you from my side of it, I'd rather see people in person, but I've been seeing people online for many years for various reasons. They can't get to my office, or, you know, they live out of the area, or their child is not going to be able to sit in the room with me in person, whatever. Everybody is now so familiar with being online because of this stupid pandemic. Everybody knows how to do Zoom. And so I have done a lot of therapy sessions online and with probably close to the same results, positive results, as seeing people in person. It's just a little harder to do hands-on things especially with younger kids who are better served by doing, hands-on kinds of things, play games and things like that. But how do you do that with OT?
I would say it's easier, depending on the age. It's easier with teenagers and young adults, or young and old adults. The younger kids, it is more challenging, and for some people, depending on what their triggers are, the telehealth might be a less stressful option for them. I have an adult client that, because of distance, I'm seeing her remotely, and I'm starting with another young adult, 25-year-old. We're going to do a hybrid, also because of the distance from our clinic, and it's been okay. Ideally, I would prefer to see the person here. I think there's something to be said about that live connection, but it's doable.
I think, from the perspective of autism, I think screens can be pretty powerful as far as attending and interacting and video modeling. I think it's a very powerful tool in autism. And so I can see some definite pros there. I think if, with the sensory approaches that we use in OT, especially for self-regulation, I think there's a little bit of a hindrance and then dependence on parents to be involved to assist with facilitating as needed for anything that requires physical engagement or movement. But I think otherwise, telehealth can be a pretty powerful tool, especially with regard to access and something that's so specialized, and there's so few people that really are thinking about it and understanding it and aware of it. I think it opens up a lot of doors. I agree.
Someone had asked on the Q&A about how do they find services, and the first suggestion I would make is going to your insurance company and finding, if you're in the US, going to your insurance company and finding providers within your network. And you're just going to have to start making phone calls and asking, well, I will say, before I forget, call many places and get your name on everybody's list, because everybody has wait lists now, and the wait lists are longer than they used to be. But start asking the question, is anyone on your staff familiar with misophonia? And if the answer is no, are they willing to learn? Honestly, as a professional, if it's within my scope, but I'm not familiar with what this disorder or diagnosis is, then that's my responsibility to look it up and find information. So hopefully, anyone in the OT industry would do that. And I'm assuming other people in any health field would do the same.
Jenna, are there any lists like with AOTA where you can find that somebody might be, specialized in sensory processing or something where they might have more sensory experience? I'm doubtful that there's something that specifically says misophonia, although that would be great. Maybe you and I should talk about that at some point.
Actually, there are lists on Marcia, you guys have a list on Misophonia Association, don't you? And I think Misophonia International has a list of providers, and I'm pretty sure there's several OTs. The dilemma is
Coverage.
It's not going to be that many. So, but it would be a good starting point.
Not that many, and since there's no diagnosis for your insurance company, an alternate, also valid diagnosis needs to be offered, such as,
Good point.
such as, I use, I often, if somebody needs a diagnosis for insurance, it's anxiety. It's an anxiety disorder that's covered. And it's definitely legit because people who have misophonia have a lot of anxiety. So it works. There are other diagnostic codes. The audiologists have a code they use for something called abnormal auditory perception. That's an audiology code that I've had rejected when I tried using it because I'm not an audiologist. So I use, other things that are honest and applicable. Speaking of diagnoses, there's a question in the Q&A that I want to answer. Is your diagnosis something other than misophonia if in addition to being bothered by sounds, you're triggered by person pacing and certain other things like that? Is the diagnosis something else? It feels like I'm being intolerant or judgy. So I want to address that one. There is in more recent years another labeling, which is misokinesia, which is a reaction to movement rather than only to sound. Sometimes it may be anticipatory. You're going to have a reaction to that person eating whatever that thing is, but then there's the movement where you just see them going to get the bag of whatever it is or going pick up their utensils, and you begin to get anticipatory anxiety seeing that, but that's not the same thing. There are people who seem to be reactive to certain movements, repetitive movements in particular. So it's come to be called misokinesia. One of the earlier research projects, well known, was called the brain basis for misophonia. And they did locate a specific spot in the brain that seems to be in common amongst people with misophonia and not with other people that's reactive to certain sounds. They came out with another paper called the motor basis for misophonia that has to do with movement. And it refers to something called mirror neurons. So there are things that people see, motions and so forth, that they may be reacting to, and that is now, kind of known as misokinesia, which of course is also not in any code book. But I want to go to the part of the question that was asked, are you being judgy? I've made a long list of characteristics that I've seen in people with misophonia, common characteristics. And when I first sit down with people, when I first meet with people, I will go over this list. Does this sound like you? Is this you? And almost everything on my list, they'll go, yep, that's me, that's me. And one of those things is, are you judgmental of other people's behavior? And the answer is almost always yes. I think it comes from having a very high level of expectation of yourself. There's a perfectionism that also goes along with this for whatever reason, that you try very hard to do things the right way, whatever you think the right way is supposed to be. You try to be perfect. It's impossible, of course, to be perfect, but you try. And then since you're trying to do that, you expect the same behavior on the part of other people. And when they don't try, then you get judgy about they're wrong and they shouldn't be doing that, and they're evil and they're bad and they're doing it on purpose and all those sorts of things. That being judgmental seems to be a very common characteristic that goes along with misophonia. That would be my answer to you, person who posted that question. You're probably got a combination of both. You're reactive to the visuals, and in addition to that, you get judgmental about it. So one way to deal with that part of it is remind yourself, as has been pointed out before, the other person is highly unlikely to be doing whatever it is on purpose to disrupt you. Maybe they are, but most of the time they're not.
I am seeing a few questions about autism in here, and someone also, there's a few of them. Someone mentioned something about a lot of people seem to be self-diagnosing autism. Let me just go back to the original list, which has one summary question for all of that, I believe. Is, do you see or are you aware of the relationship between autism and misophonia in adults?
I'm going to leave that to Tana, but I did want to just add very quickly about the diagnosis codes. One of the codes that's very commonly used by OTs is R as in Richard 44.8. It's the closest thing we have to encapsulating sensory processing disorder, but it also very easily can be used for the misophonia or misokinesia. The explanation is other symptoms and signs involving general sensations and perceptions. And I also use the H93.29, which has not been kicked out as an OT. So yay.
I've also used one called, I'm looking over here, mood disorder due to known physiological condition, something like that. It's an F is the first letter of it. But Tana, you want to address the thing about autism in your wheelhouse? You're muted.
Yep. Can you repeat that question, John? Because I think my internet cut out when you were halfway through.
Do you see or are you aware of a relation between autism and misophonia in adults?
In adults specifically.
That's what the question says, but I'd take it more general myself.
I think several studies have pointed to higher incidence rates across the autism spectrum and across the lifespan. I have a brief report that I published looking at the autism diagnostic interview because it was the biggest database I could find during COVID that I had access to when we couldn't really do research very easily. But it is a question that had been burning in my mind for a long time. You know, am I just seeing this increased rate? Is this something it's tricky to capture with the sensory profile or SPM specifically? But there's this one beautiful question on the ADIR that asks specifically about undue sensitivity to noise currently and ever. So if somebody is older and they were bothered by it, but now they're not bothered by it, we could still capture that. So we looked at those two questions and summarized across 4 different age groups. And we noticed a couple of things. We noticed that the incidence is potentially much higher than the general population, even though we don't really know the exact prevalence in the general population of misophonia. But and that there seems to be right at the beginning of school age, around age 6, which matches what Dr. Johnson was saying and Dr. Jaffe as well, that the age of onset being around 7, 8, and up into 13. But then we also noticed that there was a much higher rates in adults 19 to 54. So we had the last group was just adults. We just lumped together. There weren't as many of them, but much higher rates than in the non-ASD group. So there's a brief report out there with some information on that if anyone's interested. But yes, I think that there is potentially a relationship neurologically there that we need to look into further, but don't currently have answers for right now.
I want to jump to something kind of sort of related, but there's a question in the list of questions that we were sent beforehand about premature birth. And could this be a cause? The research is in its infancy since it was only identified about 20 years ago. The last 10 years have been a lot more research, and people are looking for, is there some common factor, some common cause? When I do an intake and talk with people, I ask questions about birth and pregnancy. I'm not doing formal research. I'm just trying to gather information, which I hope a researcher who has brain scan equipment will follow up with. But that is one of the things that I'm interested in. How long was there a problem with the pregnancy itself? Was there a problem with the birth itself? Was there was the baby breastfed or bottle fed? Were they in the NICU because of something or other and separated from mom for a period of time? Were there childhood medical concerns, things that happened? So we're looking at, or I am hoping that the researchers are looking at, finding any commonality. So far, in all the people that I have spent time with, I cannot say there is a single causal factor. There's a lot of theory that there is something traumatic that happened. Trauma could be something that's obvious to everybody, capital T trauma, but trauma can also be something smaller that felt traumatic to the individual. So there's a lot of speculation that something traumatic may have been what flipped this switch and caused this to start happening. Maybe people were born with this little switch installed, but something had to happen to flip it and turn it on. And maybe that's why it gets turned on suddenly. Often it's like all of a sudden the kid's screaming at the parent to stop doing whatever that is. We don't know is the bigger answer. Research is ongoing, and I don't know if they're going to come up with any single explanation other than something happened neurologically. That's what we know so far, probably.
This one is from the list. Can misophonia be misdiagnosed as schizophrenia?
I have not heard that occur. I suppose it's possible, but anything is possible to be misdiagnosed. Misophonia is misdiagnosed all the time. So I suppose it's possible. I have not heard that as a specific.
What was the question, Jolene?
Is it possible that people are misdiagnosed with schizophrenia instead of misophonia?
That would be very unusual. Schizophrenia is extremely well recognized in the psychological arena. It has been around from time out of mind. It's referred to throughout history. The thing with schizophrenia, it's hallucinatory out-of-body type experiences and a disassociation from reality. It's almost like misophonia forces people into an incredibly intense relationship with reality. They would love to be a little disassociated from their triggers. That would be like a form of heaven. But it seems to me like, I don't know who, I guess who would say that? I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist either, so I probably shouldn't talk about it, but I don't know. That seems unusual. You can have both though. You know, you can have misophonia and you can have a lot of other things. And it's not more prevalent in certain populations, say, than others. Like people think, oh, well, autism, that's the big thing, but that's actually not true. So I don't know. My experience with these individuals over 25 years has been, the astonishing thing to me has been the fact that these are perfectly developing, meeting every milestone people until a certain age, and then something just clicks on. They don't have it at 2 and 3 or 5 or whatever. Something just clicks on. The other interesting thing about the population is they're about 3/4 female, which is interesting. And secondly, they have much higher IQs than the average population, which is one of my favorite things about misophonia. They're very smart. So that's a kind of a nice thing. That's the one benefit. Most people that have misophonia smile when they hear that, and they're like, oh, good. That's good. There's something good about this.
There are a lot of good things given a way of looking at it. So again, when I go over this list of characteristics that I've seen, that's the first one I mentioned, what Marcia just said. I've never met a person with misophonia who was not very smart. That doesn't mean they get good grades, because although they usually do, most of the people I see get A's, which is saying a lot, given that they're facing difficult challenges in the classroom all the time, and to still get A's is pretty remarkable. They probably have extremely high intelligence to be able to do that. I have a theory. Again, this is something I can't prove. I'm not a brain researcher, but I wish somebody would investigate that people with misophonia have much more active neurological systems in general. I think that's why they're smart. They put things together. They're able to see how different things relate. Their brains work very quickly. And on the other side of that, that means they're also very sensitized to notice certain things that other people don't notice. I think it's two sides to the same coin. I did a presentation, I think it was last year at the convention, on the double-edged sword. Like, it's easy to see what the problems are, but if you can look for the strengths that each individual person has, which are many, they're smart, they're almost always involved in creative ventures, they're in theater or music or sports or other, artistic kinds of things. They just tend to have very, very broad possibilities for developing the positive side of what misophonia creates. And I think of it as a neurodivergence rather than a disorder in that regard. I think of autism that way as well. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong. It means there's something different. And we just haven't caught up yet, by and large, to being able to see how those differences are functional rather than dysfunctional.
I have a technical question. There are a lot of questions that are either in the Q&A or that were submitted before the session. And I know that we didn't get to a lot of them. And I can kind of feel the sense of pressure. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, we're almost out of time and we didn't get to my question. Is there a way as presenters that we can continue this conversation, it in writing to answer people's questions? Because I don't know, just throwing that out there.
Nate, are you still there?
John, Nate.
Yeah,
Hi,
I'm here.
we could probably figure that out also. I would encourage you to consider forming a group to come to the convention in November, or even form a panel of some sort to continue this conversation.
Okay. You with me, Tana?
So I went ahead and I grabbed all of the questions and I can email them out to all of the presenters. If you guys want to we can just work our way down. If you have an answer to them, I can put together something on the website for a not a FAQ, but a question and answer thing. That would be a good thing. I mean, we can update it quarterly with what we have. I guess this is at the end of the questions. I don't have all of the other ones, but I can grab the other answered questions that are on the that
Well,
they were
and
answered
don't
on
forget,
text.
and don't feel bad. Generally speaking, these free clinics, we've had up to 300 people attend these clinics. We do 3 a year, and we hardly ever get through all the questions. We only get through some. That's normal. We could sit here for the rest of our lives and probably never finish all the questions, which is good. It's a growing field.
Yeah, I see two more I wanted to hit on, but I can tell we don't have the time here with a minute to go. So does anyone have anything they'd like to say in closing before I close this out?
I would just like to say that for the people that are seeking out OT services, I can't speak for others, but if if you have found an OT who's willing to work with you, but they want some support, they're welcome to reach out to me. And I'm only one person. I don't know how many people are going to take me up on that offer, but I'll do what I can. I've done it before, and it helps to spread the knowledge, spread the word, and get more OTs working with misophonia.
Same here. And thank you for having us.
So I could say the same from the therapy side of it as well. I've worked with a lot of therapists who are seeing somebody and they contact me and they say, I don't know what to do with this person. Do you have some suggestions? I'm developing a training program for therapists so that there will be more out there to do that. Best thing I can suggest to people, I know John has these wonderful support groups, but check your calendar and plan to attend the convention, which is it's the November 2nd to 4th, in person if possible. What? I'm going to be in a room with a bunch of people who make sounds and I hate sounds. What are you talking about? It's very, very successful. We have careful rules about there are no food or drinks allowed in the meeting rooms. People can get up and leave anytime they want. We have all kinds of ways that we protect it. We have quiet snacks. we make it very, very comfortable and accommodating. I would urge you to attend in person if you can. That allows you to participate in discussion groups that will not be recorded. If you can't, then attend online, and you'll get to hear the main presentations anyway.
And Dr. Johnson, closing?
I just want to thank you sincerely for spending some of your precious free time, you two occupational therapists. You know, you're our sisters in the work, okay? We have to work together because this disorder really requires a team of professionals. There isn't one person that right now has a magic wand that fixes it. So the more we work together and the younger we can get to the kids, and we can get to pediatricians and to their teachers in school, and more awareness, constantly carrying together, the better off the person with misophonia will be. I truly believe that, and I'm very happy to have you on board. I had no idea you would arrive, and here you show up. You probably know other groups we should be approaching too. So help us, help us find who we need to connect to these individuals who, through no fault of their own, end up with this just terrible condition, just life impacting. So we got to work together, right, John? Okay.
And I guess we're on our way out the door now. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Carson, Jenna Norton, Dr. Jolene Jaffe. It only took me 6 years to say that right, but I always call you doctor. So, and psychotherapist, not psychiatrist. Thank you all for your time and for sharing with us. We appreciate you. That also goes for Dr. Johnson and Nate the Great. We appreciate all of you for coming to the online clinic. We look forward to seeing you at the next one. And we also look forward to seeing you all. That's right, all of you coming. The Misophonia Convention, whether you're with us in person in Albuquerque or with us online. It's going to be a great event. Let's see.
Yay. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank
See
you.
soon. Thank you, Nate.
Bye.
So easy. Wow, that was good attendance too.